The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is now officially 1 year old. So I figured it was only right to make a video discussing what was one of the most anticipated video game releases of all time. Tears of the Kingdom received all sorts of love and attention when it released last May, but I always find myself surprised at how quickly this game seems to have faded from the zeitgeist. It feels like people rarely discuss it these days, and oftentimes when I do see mention of it online, it's in the context of people saying that they prefer Breath of the Wild. Sure, Tears of the Kingdom was a commercial success and won multiple Game of the Year awards in 2023, and while that would be enough for practically any other game, its predecessor set the bar so high that the lack of staying power that Tears of the Kingdom seems to have feels like a bit of a disappointment. So today, in honor of the game's 1 year anniversary, I want to talk about why, despite all of its success, Tears of the Kingdom is still underrated and why I believe it's an all-time achievement and gaming masterpiece. Let's start with the elephant in the room that I already mentioned. Tears of the Kingdom was always going to face something of an uphill battle simply because of the massive shadow that its predecessor cast. When The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released in 2017, it was a revelation. It shot the Zelda series into the mainstream and completely redefined open world games as we knew them. Gone were the cluttered maps filled with icons and in-game guardrails ushering the player to a specific objective. Instead, Breath of the Wild replaced these genre mainstays with a massive open world that actually felt organic. The player could go anywhere and do anything without the game guiding them, outside of a loose story questline that was mostly ignorable. Breath of the Wild blew the minds of Zelda veterans, completely reinventing the series that they had loved for years, while also bringing in a wave of newcomers eager to get lost in the game's revolutionary open world. I remember going on a date with a girl a couple of years ago who I figured had zero interest in gaming, only to find out that she had bought a Switch solely for Breath of the Wild and had completed all 120 shrines in the game. In other words, Breath of the Wild was one of the biggest hits in video game history, and a sequel was always going to have to navigate the difficulties of living in that colossal shadow. However, there were a number of other factors that made Breath of the Wild's shadow even more imposing for its successor. The obvious one is the fact that Tears of the Kingdom essentially recycled the first game's map. Now obviously it added the Sky Islands and the depths, as well as made a few changes to the surface area, but still, a lot of people took issue with the game using the same world, calling it glorified DLC the weeks leading up to its release. Personally, I always thought this was absurd and that the game did more than enough to differentiate its map from its predecessor, but there's no denying that this decision was a turnoff for some people. And the other factor that I think ended up negatively impacting Tears of the Kingdom was just the insane amount of hype leading up to it. Like I said, Breath of the Wild is one of the biggest video game releases of all time, so the expectations for its sequel were always going to be astronomical. Combine that with Tears of the Kingdom's multiple delays, which led to the hype continuing to build unchecked for years, and you get a recipe for disappointment, no matter how the game turned out. So while there are other factors at play, I think that people's incredible experiences with Breath of the Wild and the shadow that that game cast put a bit of a cap on the heights that Tears of the Kingdom's public approval rating could reach. For a lot of people, the second time around, it just wasn't going to compare to the first. Here's the thing though, and while I realize this might be controversial to say, Tears of the Kingdom is objectively a better game than Breath of the Wild in almost every way. Granted, the one thing that Breath of the Wild will always have is that initial sense of wonder and discovery when exploring its world for the first time. If you're somebody who holds that feeling above all else, and that initial feeling of awe is what puts Breath of the Wild on an untouchable pedestal for you, then that's totally fair. I can respect that. That experience was magical for me as well. But once you look past that admittedly very large feather in Breath of the Wild's cap, I think that its sequel surpasses it in every way imaginable. Let's look at the main shortcomings of Breath of the Wild. For one, the story was paper thin. It was the first time the Zelda series ventured into the world of voice acting, which had people excited for a more dramatic and realized story, but the game simply didn't deliver in that regard. The format of the game had all the main story beats take place in flashback moments, which greatly limited the emotional impact and importance that those scenes could portray. Tears of the Kingdom, while not a storytelling masterclass by any means, runs circles around its predecessor in this regard. Personally, I think this is one of the better stories in the Zelda series, with some legitimately powerful moments. Realizing the extent of Zelda's sacrifice, or that shot of Link reaching for Zelda's hand as they fall through the sky after the final battle, are some of the most emotional scenes I've experienced in the entirety of the Legend of Zelda series. Breath of the Wild, as great as it was, never made me feel anything on that level. And speaking of that final battle, man, did Tears of the Kingdom really outdo itself in that regard. I, like many others, always thought that Breath of the Wild ended with a bit of a whimper, its final boss confrontation being little more than a rehash of a boss that you'd already fought multiple times by then. The Zelda team clearly heard these complaints and seemingly took them personally, because they made up for this in a huge way with Tears of the Kingdom's final confrontation. A multi-stage boss fight gauntlet against one of the most iconic villains in all of gaming that I think might just be the most epic moment in any Zelda game ever, other than Link stabbing Ganondorf in the freaking forehead at the end of their duel in the Wind Waker. I mean, that moment can never be topped. Another massive weakness of Breath of the Wild was its dungeons. The 4 divine beasts that it implemented in place of more traditional dungeons all had the same visual aesthetic and the same rotation-based gameplay mechanic, and at least in my eyes, completely blended together. For the life of me, I could not tell you how the 4 beasts differed from one another, or which region in Hyrule each beast resided in. Add in the fact that each dungeon had a slightly different variation of the same Ganon creature for its boss, and you're left with easily the weakest group of dungeons in any game in the series. This didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game too much at the time, as the rest of the Breath of the Wild experience more than made up for it, but better dungeons was at the top of my wish list for Tears of the Kingdom, and for the most part, the game really delivered. Tears of the Kingdom still doesn't have top tier Zelda dungeons in the traditional sense, as the title's extreme emphasis on freedom and player empowerment makes crafting those curated dungeons that the rest of the series contains difficult. But the dungeons on display here are still a massive step up from Breath of the Wild. Even if they're lacking the tighter design or more intricate puzzles that many classic Zelda dungeons feature, the fact that each one has such a distinct atmosphere and visual look make them feel so much more in line with other dungeons in the series when compared to the divine beasts of the first game. Don't get me wrong, my early hours with Tears of the Kingdom were fantastic, but the moment when I realized I was really playing something special was when I finally put the side quests aside and tackled that first dungeon. The trek to the Wind Temple was breathtaking, climbing through the clouds and ascending from platform to platform, creating one of the coolest backdrops I've experienced in gaming in a long time, and was already an experience on par with anything in Breath of the Wild for me. It was like the path to the temple was a dungeon in itself. The actual Wind Temple, while it didn't quite blow my mind, still felt like such a marked improvement over the divine beasts that I was still very happy with it. And that boss fight? Oh man, that was when I knew I was in for a ride. The boss, Colgera, is a giant flying beetle-like creature that you fight entirely in the air. Slowing down time to shoot the creature's weak spot with your bow and arrow feels incredible, and not to sound redundant, but this again felt like another all-time epic Zelda moment for me. In terms of scale and sheer coolness factor, it's in a completely different galaxy than the boss battles in Breath of the Wild, especially when that music picks up. Instant chills the first time I experienced it. While the other dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom weren't quite as memorable for me, they still all felt like bigger, more substantial offerings than anything on display in the first game, which is a theme that extends to the rest of Tears of the Kingdom as well. The scale of Tears of the Kingdom makes Breath of the Wild, a massive game in its own right, look downright small in comparison. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Tears of the Kingdom's map. Sure, it might be recycling the same base Hyrule from Breath of the Wild, but it's essentially 3 times the size now with the addition of the Sky Islands and the depths. A common complaint I hear is that the Sky Islands were oversold and underwhelmed, and I can understand that point. There is less to them than I was initially expecting based off of the trailers. However, even though the Sky Islands are easily the weakest of the 3 main regions in the game, I still really enjoyed them for what they were. Flying from island to island, tackling shrine puzzles, and searching for hidden treasure is still plenty of fun, and the skies of Hyrule provide some of the most breathtaking sights in the entire game. I'm especially fond of how the visuals differ so much from the mainland, with a beautiful autumn aesthetic and plenty of delightfully weird constructs to interact with. And the other 2 regions, man, they are phenomenal. I understand that recycling the same main map from the first game isn't as exciting as a brand new world to explore, but I think that there are enough differences here that it's still able to channel that same sense of wonder and discovery that Breath of the Wild had. Seeing civilization continue to rebuild from the first game and being able to witness firsthand the changes in locales such as Terrytown and Lookout Landing is fantastic, and something that's only possible due to the recycling of the first game's map. And the depths? I mean, how cool are they? The fact that Nintendo kept this area of the game a complete secret during all of the pre-release coverage of Tears of the Kingdom is a huge testament to them. They knew they were cooking with fire here, and deciding to keep such a massive part of the game a secret greatly added to the feeling of discovery and awe I had during my playthrough. My mind was blown when I first discovered the depths, and even more so when I realized that this massive underground labyrinth was so challenging. It's essentially a hard mode for the game, which was a much needed addition and a direct answer to another Breath of the Wild criticism. Of course, when you have a map 3 times the size of Breath of the Wild's, then obviously it's going to require more content, and once again, Tears of the Kingdom really delivers here. Tears of the Kingdom has more side quests, more shrines, and more Korok seeds than its predecessor. And while of course it's true that bigger isn't always better, I found all of the content I engaged with in Tears of the Kingdom to be on par with or superior to the content in Breath of the Wild. Some of the side quests are especially thoughtful and really help flesh out the world of Hyrule and the characters that inhabit it. The Terrytown questline involving Hudson and his daughter is especially emotional, containing some of the best character work in the entire game. And all of this praise is before even discussing the new gameplay mechanics that Tears of the Kingdom added. The additions of mechanics like Fuse and Ultra Hand help turn this game into one of the greatest sandboxes in gaming history. I'll be the first to admit that the building aspect of Tears of the Kingdom isn't really targeting the kind of player that I am. As much as I love giant open worlds in my video games, I also love defined, concrete solutions to the problems in them as well. When a game like Tears of the Kingdom gives you countless different ways to tackle its puzzles or traverse its world, I find that my brain usually goes blank. I'm not the kind of person who's going to be creating giant robotic mechs in Tears of the Kingdom and sharing the footage on TikTok, but I have immense respect for the gamers who are able to do that sort of thing. What's especially impressive to me, though, is that even though this core component of Tears of the Kingdom's DNA doesn't appeal to me in the slightest, it also didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game at all. I was perfectly content with looking up a hovercraft bike design online, building that, and then rarely engaging with the building mechanics again unless I was required to. But the fact that those mechanics are even there just makes me respect Tears of the Kingdom even more. The building component is basically a second game built into the game, one that creative players could spend hundreds upon hundreds of hours with alone. The fact that such a massive gameplay feature exists, while also not detracting from the experience of players who aren't particularly interested in it, is hugely impressive to me, and something else that I think this game deserves massive credit for. And finally, one other thing that Tears of the Kingdom has over Breath of the Wild: you can build Link a house. Throw a house building / decorating mechanic into a game, and I am sold. Anyway, I just wanted to spend some time gushing about Tears of the Kingdom for its anniversary because I really do think it's incredible. I get that it sounds a bit silly to call Tears of the Kingdom underrated after all the accolades it received, but a year after its release, I truly feel like this game doesn't get talked about enough. I guess that's what happens when you have to follow in the footsteps of one of the best and most monumental games of all time. For a lot of people, nothing is ever going to compare to that first experience. For me though, I can't imagine ever going back to Breath of the Wild after having experienced Tears of the Kingdom. In my eyes, it's a certified masterpiece and one of the best games ever made. I hope it's remembered that way, and not just as a sequel to Breath of the Wild.